So like Faya just said, many of you know me as a co-founder, an event organizer, a consultant, a pet owner. Some of you know that I'm also a psychotherapist. And you may even know that in my psychotherapy practice, I've worked with people to mitigate and even transform the negative effects of trauma and adversity, including sexual assault, veterans, former inmates, relational adversity, and more. What many of you don't know about me, because it happened 19 years ago, long before I've met almost all of you, is that I'm also a survivor of domestic violence. And in this talk, I'll share with you some about my story. So I will have a trigger warning for some of the more triggering material. I will also share some about trauma, some about the difficulties for domestic violence survivors, and some about the possible effects of trauma, both the bad and the good. Before we begin, though, a quick story about these two images. In grad school, one of the sayings that often was said was, "We build our walls out of the bricks that are thrown at us." And one of my personal goals for myself is to transform those bricks into something beautiful. Regarding my marriage, I was lucky because I got out early and on the first try. I had a lot going in my favor. It takes on average 7 attempts before a person leaves an abusive relationship, and there are over 50 obstacles that may get in the way. One of them is that they might have children. Well, I didn't have any children. Another one is financial dependence. I wasn't dependent on him. In fact, I was the primary breadwinner in that relationship. Another is family stigma regarding divorce. And I didn't have that either. My father and his brother and my mother's and her sisters had all been divorced at least once. There's religious pressure to stay. Often you hear about the sanctity of marriage. It's about God and church. There's a lot of pressure to stay in a marriage that's not working from people's religion or culture. I didn't have that either. And there are no safe alternatives. I had a safe alternative. I could move back home. It was safe for me to go home. And another one is fear of retaliation or threat to life. While he never told me he would kill me if I left, he did threaten me. And that picture of choking, or strangulation actually, choking is when you've got something in your throat, strangulation is when somebody is constricting it from the outside, is a warning sign. If you're ever choked in a DV relationship, you are 7 times more likely to die from homicide. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what trauma is. My working definition of trauma. This means that something doesn't necessarily have to fit the clinical definition of PTSD to be called a trauma, or to have an impact, like a huge impact on your functioning, although it usually does. Oftentimes, childhood events that would seem minor to an adult leave us thinking about ourselves and the world in unhelpful ways until we work on it. An example could be kids sometimes feel like they're not enough or it was their fault, and those are related to things that happen that as an adult we could totally handle it. But as a kid, maybe not. And then, of course, there's child abuse and other adverse experiences. So trauma is pain that exceeds our capacity to handle pain. And that's also why some people will respond differently to different events, because some people have different capacities. And there's a huge confluence of factors that go into what determines that, but we're not going to get into that. Another example, another working definition is trauma at its core is a loss or crisis of meaning. Oftentimes, the worldview that people have after a big trauma can be kind of dismantled. And it's really difficult to cope with that. And then a third one is trauma is not what happens to us, but what we hold inside in the absence of an empathetic witness. And I'll give you an example. I'll quote, there's a woman, Jessica Stern, she's an expert on terrorism, but she also wrote a book, Denial, a Memoir of Terror, about the research she did on the man who raped her when she was a teenager. And she says, "The dizziness brought on by the denial of others is often worse than the original crime. When authorities disbelieve the victim, when bystanders refute what they cannot bear to know, they rob the victim of a normal existence on earth." And so when we are able to provide empathy and compassion and support to someone, we can actually often sometimes help them grow through that trauma. So how many of you have heard of PTSD? Just a quick show of hands. Okay, that looks like almost everyone in the room. So PTSD, the basic definition is the person was exposed to death, actual or threatened serious injury, or actual or threatened sexual violence, and remains or becomes symptomatic 6 months from the time of the event with a specific set of symptoms. Exposed can include direct experience, witnessing, indirectly hearing about a close friend or loved one, or in the course of professional duties, such as, clergy sometimes have this, or therapists if they work specifically with trauma. Although you can work through that too, but that's another talk. 7 to 8% of the population will have PTSD at some point in the course of their lives. That's 7 or 8 out of every 100 people. But there are about an average of 5.2 million people diagnosed with PTSD every year. Even if you don't develop PTSD, you may have post-trauma symptoms that don't meet the criteria, and you may want to consider processing those in order to function better in the world. So just because I had things working in my favor did not mean I didn't develop trauma symptoms. In the next slide, I'll share with you a few vignettes. And if you don't want to hear it, cover your ears and look at Tigger. And the screen will say done when I'm done talking about this. So these are excerpts from a journal I had kept, and I adapted it a little bit for time. The first time I felt it, open hand across my cheek, slow motion, stinging, shock, disbelief. I wasn't even sure it had really happened. The next time we were discussing whether or not to get a phone line installed, I said yes, he said no, he slapped me again. The discussion was over. He yelled at me because men I didn't even notice looked at me. He said he'd cut me in half and make me watch as he pulled my guts out if he ever saw me so much as speak to them. He called me a whore and a bitch because someone else looked at me. He pulled his fist back and dropped it to his side. He wanted to make love. My best friend had been coming by, trying to get a chance to hang out with me. It had been a while. I'd been forbidden from seeing most of my friends. He wanted her to stop coming by, so he agreed to go out on a double date. We went over to their place for pizza, a movie, and a beer. I fell asleep halfway through. My friends retired to the bedroom. He had 12 beers, and I woke up with him 3 inches from my face, holding me by the neck, whispering. And I did whatever he wanted me to do to get through the next moment. So let's talk, I'll tell you a little bit about my trauma symptoms. And they are recurrent involuntary intrusive memories. I don't have those anymore. I can think about it, it doesn't bother me. But I had that for a while. Effortful avoidance of external reminders, so I actively avoided things that reminded me of him. For many, many years, I couldn't date blondes. He was blonde. And even still, anyway. Persistent and distortive negative beliefs about myself. Those came up. A lot of people end up with those. Persistent distorted blame or self for causing the event and resulting consequences. Negative trauma-related emotions, especially shame, guilt, and anger. I was very angry at myself. Constricted affect, inability to experience positive emotions. I could still get better at that, but it doesn't bother me that I'm not necessarily as bubbly as like other people. Self-destructive and reckless behavior. That is also something that often occurs in the wake of trauma, though not always. So, and sleep disturbance. For a couple months after I was in bed, I could not get out of bed for more than 4 hours at a time. And I don't know if that was trauma-related or if I just got very sick. So how many of you have heard of post-traumatic growth? Post-traumatic growth. So Almost all of you raised your hand for PTSD, and maybe 7 of you are raising your hand for post-traumatic growth. So the concept is timeless. If you want to read a great story about it, read Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning. And it was in 1995, those two guys coined the term post-traumatic growth. It's a construct of positive psychological change, sorry for the typo, that occurs as the result of one's struggle with a highly challenging, stressful, or traumatic event. It is distinct from resilience or optimism because it involves a movement beyond pre-trauma levels of adaptation. And even when you experience post-traumatic growth, it doesn't necessarily mean you stop having all the trauma symptoms, though for some it does. And I'll repeat something that is true for me and what I've helped people achieve. It involves a movement beyond pre-trauma levels of adaptation. That means sometimes you can be even better than you were before the event. But I want to stress that's not always, and it's really different for everybody. Post-traumatic growth does not mean you did not suffer, and in some cases, people may develop PTSD first. Not everyone experiences post-traumatic growth. Sometimes the event is too distressing to move that way, and for some people, the more resilient you are, the less growth you're going to experience because you're less distressed to begin with because you have more coping skills to begin with. And the research is not meant to negate negative post-trauma responses. Rather, it has an important implication regarding the identity narratives related to people who've experienced trauma. There is life beyond survival. It is possible to thrive. So factors that play a role in post-traumatic growth. So there are 5, it's measured on 5 subscales. First I'll get to factors that play a role in post-traumatic growth. Openness to experience, extroversion, community support, grieving and accepting what happened. In some cases, forgiveness. Optimists, I'm not an optimist. Identity, help with developing an identity narrative that supports growth. Meditation. Meditation is good for so many things. Like, if you're not doing it, please do it. One of the factors, and there are different styles, but that's another talk too. One of the factors that helped me cultivate, that helped me go through post-traumatic growth, which is an ongoing unfolding process, it's not just one and done, was cultivating self-compassion. And I still sometimes will experience a trigger in my environment related to a past trauma, not necessarily the one I talked about today. And now that I'm at the point where I can look forward to it, because it means I can work through it and find another layer of freedom from past conditioning. It's also possible to have growth in some areas and not others. So the subscales of post-traumatic growth, this basically just means like the factors that go into it, and I'll wrap it up because I know we're running tight on time. So new possibilities have emerged from the struggle. So that could be you find new opportunities, new ways of growing, new things you want to do that you might never have thought of. Like, there are people that start all kinds of nonprofits because they want to help people who've been through something they've been through. The way you relate to others. So it can help you increase intimacy, especially if you have safe people to share this sort of thing with. It can also increase your compassion for what other people have gone through. It can also help with empathy. Greater appreciation of life. Sometimes it can make you just glad to be alive. Spiritual or religious change. And personal strength. If I lived through that, I can live through anything. So that's my talk for today. I think I made it in about 14 minutes. I do want to tell a brief story about the bonsai tree. So bonsai trees are shaped by trauma. They are shaken, they are cut, they are put in little tiny things that they're not necessarily supposed to grow in to begin with, and they don't lose their treeness. We don't lose our humanity just because we've been through a trauma. So thank you very much.